Well, it's certainly a pleasure to meet with you here in San Francisco. I have some claim to California that many of you perhaps don't have, in that my grandmother was born here. My great-grandfather was from Omaha, and my grandmother from California, but somehow we reversed that trend and ended up back in New England. I am a farmer now in Pennsylvania, and I raise corn. Mother Bloor, a famous or notorious American radical, depending on your point of view, advised farmers to raise less corn and more hell. I was trying to do the opposite the last 3 years. I was trying to raise more corn and less hell, but the weather didn't cooperate. And I had a crop failure last year, and the only thing that saved the situation was the publication of my book, Fanshen, which came out in December of '66. So I arranged some turbulence in China to serve as a launching platform for this book. Some years ago, Senator Eastland gave a speech on the Senate floor in Washington that lasted for 3 or 4 hours, and in this speech he proved that I had organized the Chinese Revolution. So it was a simple matter to organize a second revolution in time to launch my book. But I'm not going to talk about basically about the book tonight, only to say that if you do have a chance to, if you do buy it or otherwise have a chance to read it, I think it will help you to understand what's happening in China today, more perhaps than any other single book that you could read, because at least in part what is happening in China today is a movement to rectify and purify the Chinese Communist Party. And this is not the first such movement that has occurred in recent years. The most well-known such movement was the great Zhengdang, or Party Rectification, of 1942 in China, which prepared the communists for the reversal of the situation after the Japanese War had been won. A second great movement occurred at the time of that my book describes, when after 3 years of land reform in areas of North China, many mistakes had occurred, many communists had abused their positions, and many problems had arisen, and a tremendous rectification movement occurred all throughout North China after only 3 years of power by the Communist Party. Later, other movements occurred. In '52, there was a rectification movement against graft, corruption, and bureaucracy, which answered the problem of the entry into the cities and the influence of the merchants and industrialists who were bribing and otherwise trying to break down the honesty of the communist leaders at all levels. There was another campaign at the time of the collectivization of agriculture, the formation of cooperatives and communes in China, and this campaign today represents perhaps the greatest, the deepest, the sharpest of these struggles that has occurred. It occurs at a time when China is passing from one phase of her revolution to another. And this point, I think, must be grasped if one is to understand what's going on today. It is not generally understood that the Chinese Revolution has, for many years, up to about 1956 or 7, been in content what Marxists call a democratic revolution, a bourgeois democratic revolution in the sense that its goals were land reform and national independence. Now, land reform and national independence are not socialist goals. They are goals that many countries have carried out without any socialists and without any communists. The French Revolution was a revolution that broke up feudalism in France. The English Revolution did the same in England. We never had too much feudalism in this country, and our revolution was mainly one for national independence. But these goals, though, are part of an earlier revolution, and but for China they were essential. Before China could talk about socialism, she had first to destroy the old feudal landlord gentry domination, and she had first to become an independent nation. And this struggle lasted, some people date it from 1840, when the first battles against England were fought at the time of the Opium War. From that time until the late 50s, there were just two goals in China: to free the country and to end the old feudal land system. And these goals united a vast majority of the people in a rather unique alliance, an alliance of socialists with capitalists. For the capitalists, this alliance was essential because unless they ended feudalism in the countryside, they couldn't establish a national market, and unless they drove the foreigner out of China, they couldn't establish a national industry. They couldn't even establish a toothpaste industry because Pepsodent and Colgate were dumped in without tariffs at prices that they couldn't begin to compete with. So they had to join in this revolution, the capitalists and the merchants. The communists, the socialists, the radical revolutionaries of China, since 1920 at least, had to join in this alliance because they couldn't talk about socialism until some of these other problems had been solved. These problems were solved in the late 40s and early 50s of this century. China's national independence was secured by the victory in 1949, and the feudal system was completely dismantled during the land reforms, which ended in 1953, and then began the transition to socialism, which is still going on today. Now, it goes without saying that in such a great transition, and I believe one could well say it's the greatest transition in history for any country, a transition from essentially a private property society to a publicly owned society, from private enterprise and production to socialism and the foundations of communism. This is the greatest transition that any society can go through. Therefore, it's not strange that the alliance which arose to accomplish certain definite goals would not survive such a transition, that people who joined together and fought for 40 years against landlord gentry system and foreign domination might well break up over the question of what society to build in the place of the old. And this is certainly the case at this time. Now, the first steps toward socialism were taken in China in the late 50s. Since the communists were the dominant factor in the alliance, they determined the future and began to move toward a socialist society by first leading the peasants to a cooperative agriculture. This was done over a period of several years and ended with an organization of communes throughout the rural areas of China. The other step which they took was to buy out their erstwhile allies, the national bourgeoisie of China, the merchants and industrialists of China and to make public property out of what had formerly been private enterprise. They bought out the whole class, not with money, but with government bonds. And these merchants and industrialists were given shares, government bonds, which drew 5% interest for their shares in their former holdings. Many of them were employed as managers and technicians in the plants that they used to own. And this arrangement continues to this day. These two reforms, you might say, laid the foundations of a socialist society. But the foundations are one thing. The culture, the politics, the civilization to be built on this foundation is quite another. And unless a solid superstructure of socialist in kind is built, it's very possible for disruption and disunity to occur and for a reversal to take place in the economy. There are some socialist-minded people, some Marxists, who think rather mechanically that if you have an economy, the culture naturally follows. Didn't Marx say that the relations of production were basic and that the superstructure was built upon it? Therefore, the thinking is that if you have a publicly owned economy and a cooperative agriculture, ipso facto, the culture and politics and civilization of socialism just follow. It isn't at all that simple. And after all, there is a tremendous drag on this whole thing from the habits and customs of centuries in the minds of people, and it is no easy thing to shift from a private property, private enterprise system to a socialist one and all the values that go with it. So that a conscious struggle must be made to transform a country, and it continues over a long period of time. This struggle is now going on in China, and it will certainly continue for some time. It has come in a series of waves. At the time of these two early reforms, there was a wave of a fairly sharp struggle with certain leaders and cadre, most of them not communists, who didn't want to build socialism in China. This occurred at the time of the 100 Flowers movement in 1957. These men who were labeled rightists were removed from office at that time, and the country proceeded to carry through these basic socialist reforms, disregarding their advice. After the establishment of the communes and the buying out of the commercial and industrial groups, China went through several very poor years, partly due to policy problems, but mainly due to the fact that the weather was bad. The crops were bad, there were terrible droughts and terrible floods. Also due to the fact that at that time they broke with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union withdrew all aid from China and called home all her technicians, and they took all their blueprints with them. These rough years delayed, I think, the cultural struggle that is taking place today, and it wasn't until 4 or 5 years of steady progress, bringing China to the most prosperous condition that China has ever known, that this struggle broke out anew. What I am basically trying to say is that this present turmoil and struggle is a product of China's own internal development. It is due to the fact that the old problems of China have been solved. It arises out of the very success of the first stage of the Chinese Revolution. Because the first stage was so successful, China has moved to the second stage of this revolution, and it is this stage that has brought new problems, new contradictions, and a split among both people and leaders as to the shape of the future. And so I think this is the framework that one has to, in which one has to view these events. Without this framework, it becomes impossible to understand what is going on. So, what in fact is the content of this struggle is a struggle between the bourgeois line and as Marxists say, a bourgeois line and a proletarian line. In modern terms, a revisionist line and a revolutionary line, between the merchants and industrialists as a class and those who support them in every walk of life, including the leaders in the Communist Party, and the workers and peasants and the party as it represents them. There is an additional factor here in the stake which many cadre have in the more or less privileged position which they've acquired in 17 years of communist rule. Although China is a country where there is the least difference between high and low pay, between high and low salaries, the highest paid people in China get only about 3 times what the average factory worker or peasant will earn. Still, if one is in a position of leadership and power on a provincial or municipal level, one can, if one is not scrupulously honest and self-denying, one can take advantage of position to make life somewhat easier for oneself than that for the average person. So here is another social base for a split in the society. Well, the whole thing began about a year and a half ago. This phase of it began about a year and a half ago in the field of culture. It showed up most sharply between a group of leading intellectuals and the Communist Party leaders supporting Mao. It began with a play, just one play, written by Wu Han, the vice mayor of Peking, who is a communist of many years' standing and an intellectual, a writer in China. He wrote a play called Huai Dismissed from Office. It was about an ancient emperor and a prime minister named Huai Rei, and Huai Rei was dismissed, and the play says he shouldn't have been. He should be recalled, and his policies should be followed. It seemed simple enough, but in fact it was a parable. And Huai Rei stood for those rightists who were dismissed in the late 50s for their anti-socialist views and policies. And the emperor stood for Mao and the Central Committee of the Chinese Party. And the play says that Mao should recall those rightists and follow their policies. This play created a sensation in China and began a great debate. The debate soon spread to 3 Peking newspapers that were edited by colleagues of Wu Han. They were the Front Line, the Peking Evening News, and the Peking Daily News. These 3 papers were oriented to the cultural life of the country. They weren't the main newspapers, but they were papers of comment and opinion, and they carried columns with very typically Chinese names. One of these columns was called Evening Chats at Yanshan, and another column was called Notes from Three Family Village. And they took up systematically the policies of the Chinese government and criticized them, ridiculed them, and proposed alternatives. They didn't do it directly. They didn't say, we think the Communist Party is wrong and this and this and this should be done. They did it by innuendo, by parable, by fable, and by ridicule, without naming the objects of ridicule often. It was only in terms of the whole series of articles that one could see what, in fact, they were talking about. And these articles ran for 3 or 4 years, written by Wu Han, Deng Do, and their colleagues in the Peking municipal government. These men were all communists, and when the debate arose over Huayre, this play, it spread to these three papers, to these columns, and very searching analysis was made of what exactly these men were talking about. The debate reached to Peng Jun, the mayor of Peking, who was dismissed for his support of this position, and reached to Zhou Yang, the minister of culture, who supported Peng Jun and this whole group in the Peking municipal government. In order to get some idea of exactly what these positions were, I would like to just review briefly Zhou Yang's position versus that of Mao. Now, lest there be some who think that these cultural things are not important, I would only explain that in China they would consider this extremely important. Here are two different views on the whole question of culture being put forth by revolutionaries. This is not a quarrel between revolutionaries and some opposition about what culture should be. These are two views on culture among the revolutionaries themselves. And it's quite obvious that along with these cultural views go different views in terms of national policy as a whole, and that both cannot be right. There cannot be, in fact, two practical, correct revolutionary positions for Chinese. One or the other must be the way to do it. So they take this question very seriously and feel that the opposition is preparing the ground in the cultural field for great changes in the country as a whole, and take up this challenge and debate with them and argue it out. Now, Mao's position has been for many years that artists and writers, revolutionary artists and writers, must serve the workers, peasants, and soldiers, a direct class position in literature and art. That they must, since most of them are intellectuals from the big cities of merchant or industrial background or free professional background, sons of doctors, lawyers, businessmen, or whatever, that they must go among the people, learn the life of the people, join in the struggle of people, both in war and in construction and in land reform or whatever that may be, and write in such a way as to reflect this life and these struggles and to unite people to build a new country. Now, Zhou Yang didn't quarrel with this position during the Japanese War. He, in fact, supported it. But after the victory of the party in the country as a whole and the establishment of the new government in Peking, he put forth a different position, which was above class. He said that artists and writers should write for the whole people, that they should create works which would find an echo in all walks of life. And he, in fact, stood by a position of classical humanism, that all men are brothers, that the finest emotion of an artist or a creative person should be love of mankind. Mao had always maintained that in a class society you cannot speak of love of mankind, that the slave can't love the slave master, the tenant can't love the landlord, and the worker can't love the boss. You have to throw the exploiter off your back before you can talk about equality, and only with equality can come brotherhood. So here you had two rather sharp and distinct positions. To carry it a little further, Zhou Yang held up as examples for Chinese writers the 19th century novels of Europe, the great realist novels of 19th century Europe. And he published the translations of these novels in large editions in China and encouraged young people to emulate them. He allotted very little paper even for Marxist works and for the works of Mao and other Chinese leaders. At the same time, he was very fond of the ancient Chinese opera and promoted it in many ways, and did very little about reforming the opera or creating new works in opera which would reflect modern life. Now, Mao was not against 19th century novels or even the old Chinese opera. He was a reader of those novels and a fan of the Chinese opera, but he thought that revolutionaries should operate on a different basis and that they should create new works which reflect the struggle of people today and the lives of workers, peasants, and soldiers, and help them to create a new China. The old operas were all about kings, princes, concubines, and generals, and had very little to do with modern problems or modern life. Zhou Yang used only criterion of form when judging a work. He said if a film had good actors, good script, good music, and good shots, it was a good film. He didn't judge what it said as being very important. Mao said in any class society, what a work says comes before the way in which it says. That form is secondary to content and always will be as long as there are classes, since what is said reflects the views of one class or another. Zhou Yang encouraged young people toward careerism and urged that they make themselves famous, writers, artists, and so on, and he thought they should be highly paid for such work. He advocated big awards and high living standards for successful creative people. Mao had always said that they should work to serve the people, that they shouldn't demand special privileges, and that they should be content to live at the same level as the rest of the society, and that they should all move up together. As China advanced, so would everyone advance with her. In brief, are some of the issues which divided these two groups. And in talking to American audiences about them and in discussions afterward, I found that Zhou Yang speaks to the condition of Americans. Most people regard his views as being much closer to their own than Mao, which leads me to believe that Mao is probably right when he says that Zhou Yang is a bourgeois thinker. This would seem to follow. At least most of the audiences to which I've spoken are from universities, professors, teachers, professional people, and many people of means, along with many working people, of course. But in general, people feel that Zhou Yang has the better of the argument. Well, these things, this whole debate in the field of culture caused a tremendous stir in China, and it was carried on all last winter. And by spring it had reached to the whole educational system and to students in the colleges and in the high schools. And in June last spring, 12 students at the Peking University put up a poster on the wall critical of their president, the president of the Peking University. This is the most important university in China. It is the national university. We have nothing comparable in this country unless it would be the pre-Reagan University of California. But actually, I don't think that there is any single university that plays the role in American life that Peking University plays in Chinese life. Almost every wave of the modern revolution in China has begun with students at Peking University. The May 4th movement of 1919, from which people date the modern revolution in China, began with students in Peking University. Mao Zedong himself studied Marxism at Peking University when he learned his first lessons of Marxism when he was librarian there. The founders of the Chinese Communist Party, among them were professors at Peking University. And each succeeding wave of the revolution has found its first adherents there, and from the students there it has spread to the whole of Chinese society. I'll never forget the first day that I arrived in Peking in 1947. 100,000 students were demonstrating in the streets against the American Marines and demanding that they go home. And of course, there were plenty of peasants fighting in the hills who had the same objective. But the students helped to mobilize the workers and people in all walks of life for this same program. So Peking University plays an important role, and 12 students in Peking University putting up a poster critical of the president was a national event. Now, the president reacted as any good American college president would. He said the students were anarchists and troublemakers. And he tried to shut them up. But Mao, on the other hand, saw the poster, or it came to his attention, and he said, publish it. It was published nationwide in the press, and it was considered to be that spark that would open up the whole subject in a nationwide debate. This poster was no sooner published than student groups arose all over the country, emulating these 12 Peking students. Student organizations sprang up like mushrooms after spring rain. They had as many positions as there were, certainly more than there were schools, because in every school many groups sprang up. In the Foreign Language Institute, where I have friends who correspond with me, there were 65 different groups of Red Guards organized there after June through the summer and early fall, and they all had a different position on the affairs of the day. Now, they didn't run the gamut from left to right. There were no John Birchers among them. They were all on the left. They were all militant, rebellious students who had studied revolution for many years, had read Mao carefully. They all supported Mao, and they supported his position, but they disagreed as to what was wrong with their university, what should be done about it, what was wrong with China, what should be done about it, what was important in what Mao said on this or that topic, or what was really Marxism as applied to their current situation. The same type, 65 groups in one institute alone, this same multiplicity arose all over the country. It was not organized by anybody. The students organized themselves. All the leaders did was to give them the green light, say, go ahead and speak your minds, say what's wrong. Now, the one reason that the leaders felt that this was timely was the fact that this is the first generation in China of students who are of worker and peasant origin. In the old society, almost no one born in a peasant family or worker family ever reached primary school, much less high school and college. But since 1949, thousands and millions of young worker and peasant sons and daughters have been educated in the primary schools, and they are going on through secondary and higher schools, and this whole generation has now arrived at the university level, and there are millions of students of worker and peasant origin there now. Some 80% of the students are from these classes, and their dissatisfaction with many things is only excelled by their dissatisfaction with the university system as such. In order to understand that, I think you have to realize that China's modern university system was created wholesale that it was transferred wholesale from the West. Her old education system was scrapped in the 20th century, and modern universities were built as exact copies of American and British and Western European universities. Mostly the American model was used. And everything from the courses right down to the curricula, professors and everything. The professors were trained in the West and brought back to China to teach. And in fact, in most universities originally they studied in English, not in Chinese. To give you an example of some of the absurdities of this system, I, of course, am a farmer, and I graduated from Cornell in agriculture. In the College of Agriculture in Peking, there was a professor who also graduated from Cornell, and he taught livestock. He taught the course he learned at Cornell. He examined his students on such questions as the address of the Ayrshire Breeders Association in Blandon, Vermont, and the Brown Swiss Breeders Association in Beloit, Wisconsin. Things like this. It was unique knowledge. No one could deny that. And he was well paid as an expert, you know. An expert is an ordinary fellow a long way from home. And that's why I can lecture to you about China. But in any case, this was the kind of thing that Chinese students had to study, and it did them very little good. Now, this kind of flagrant abuse of education, many such examples were corrected after 1949. This particular professor was sent with a group of students to the Northwest to see if there were any cattle in China, and to discover whether there might not be valuable breeds in China that could be turned into beef or dairy cattle. He found, of course, the Guangzhou Niu, the Guangzhou cow, the red cow of Shenxi, which is a tremendous basic breeding stock, and he did some good work. He learned a lot about cattle. And this particular abuse was, to that extent, overcome. But there were many equally absurd things and many much more subtle things that were built into this system which did not suit particularly the worker and peasant students coming up in this generation. They felt a built-in bias against their cultural background and their education, which is the same that rural children from our South or children from the ghettos of our big northern cities feel coming into our educational system here in America. There are many changes that have to be made before these systems will suit people of different cultural backgrounds. So they made very sharp criticisms of their university system, and one of the things they particularly were opposed to was the examination system. They felt that just promoting people and choosing them for college on the basis of a few hours of examination, written exam, was hardly the best way to do. They advocate a much broader criteria for choosing people than how you write a written exam, and for promoting people later. Under this barrage of criticism, which was occurring all over China, the schools were shut down for reorganization, and the young people were urged to jump into a nationwide political struggle to settle not only the issue of education, but the whole future of the country. They immediately began to establish liaison between themselves, and Peking students went out to the provinces and provincial students came to the capital. The government gave them free railroad transportation wherever they wanted to go. As long as they were members of any Red Guard organization, they could travel anywhere. The government suggested that the university students could come to the capital en masse, but that high school students should send delegations. But the high school students didn't agree to this, and they all came too. They came into Peking last summer and fall at the rate of 40 to 50,000 a day. And there were as many as 2 million out-of-town students in town at any one time. And they joined in this debate basically with wall posters. Peking is a wonderful city for wall posters because it has hundreds of miles of walls. Chinese houses face into a courtyard, and on the outside are simply blank walls. And street after street in Peking, you see nothing but bare walls with a gate every so often. There's plenty of room to debate, plenty of room to hang a poster, and it's a very good medium for debate because you can answer your opponent within minutes after he has put up his poster. You don't have to wait to set type, to read proof, to roll the presses and all that. Your opponent puts up a poster, 3-4 minutes later you answer him. It was a tremendous outpouring of discussion. They call it in China extensive democracy. The students debated and established liaison, covered almost all of Peking's walls with posters. They also used mimeograph sheets, rallies, speeches, newspapers, and other means as well, supplementing this poster debate. And then they wouldn't go home. They demanded first to see Mao before they went home. Now you can understand that a young person growing up in China, where Mao has led the country for 40 years, the outstanding revolutionary leader, a man getting on in years who may not live many more years, and you don't always get a free ticket to Peking, and you may not always be able to come. They wanted to see Mao while they were there. Chani met with them, the foreign minister Chani, but that didn't satisfy them. Zhou Enlai talked with them, the premier, but that didn't matter either. They wanted to see Mao himself before they went home. So 11 large rallies were organized in succession for the leaders to meet with these young people, and they met with 1 million to 2 million at a time, all through the fall. These rallies had no significance. Our papers were scratching their heads. What's all this about? What are these rallies for? The significance of these rallies was these young people wanted to see Mao. No one planned it that way. They just wouldn't go home until they had done it. The alternative was to get the army out and load them on trains, so it was much better to meet with them. After that, they went home without any problems, and new waves poured in. And as winter came on, they were encouraged to end this mass traveling and go home and organize in their home communities. The free transportation was done away with for outward travel, but you could get home with a free ticket. As a result of this, many started walking on their own all over the country to carry the issues of this cultural revolution to the countryside and to distant places. And they started this tradition, or carried on this tradition of long marches, based on the fact of Mao's own but youth, when he wandered through the countryside, working here and studying there and moving on, learning conditions in China. He wandered several years that way. Also based on the long march of the Chinese Red Army when it moved from South China through the west and ended up at Yan'an. I have a letter here from an American woman, Doris Dawson, who went to China some years ago to live with her daughter, who's married to a Chinese technician, and the daughter has a daughter, 17 years old. Mrs. Dawson is a grandmother, and she has stayed on in China with her family there, and she recently, in November, wrote this letter about the young Red Guards traveling. She says, all young China is traveling. Now free train service is stopped except to get them home. It will take 5 weeks to clear Shanghai, and Peking has had 9 million visitors. Actually, Peking had 12 million before they were over. But the idea of little long marches spread before this, and thousands are traveling on foot. I can describe one of these from inception. In October, 5 girls, Lily, my granddaughter, is one, and 5 boys, all of them athletes, conceived the idea of a march. By the 22nd, these 17 and 18-year-olds had measured distances on their school atlas, which is their road map, and laid plans to walk to Peking via Yan'an allowing 2 months for the trek. That's the equivalent of walking from Los Angeles to San Francisco by way of Denver, Colorado. Starting on November 1st, they would reach Peking for New Year festivities and see Chairman Mao. Now to talk it over at home and with the city party committee for sanction and a letter of verification. Not one family held back, which shows the spirit universal today. For Lily and another girl are the only two not needed at home for work or to lighten the load of the breadwinner. 8 families pulled in their belts, flexed their muscles, schemed as to expenses on the march, and gave wholehearted support. But the city party committee hesitated with paternal forebodings and nearly drove the youngsters mad before coming through handsomely with a letter, red armbands, and the 10 yuan a month for each toward food. That'd be about the equivalent of $5 and would be their regular school stipend. This delay took up time, and the young people strongly criticized the committee. They had to start off a day later than scheduled. It doesn't sound like too bad a bureaucracy. And on a longer track than planned, as I shall tell. A dancer, Lily, and another girl made up a crosstalk team with the girls, musicians, a speaker among the boys, and singers all for entertainment in villages, stencils to use on village mimeographs, and paper to add to their loads for propaganda and news for isolated spots. Quilts in place of sleeping bags, padded winter clothes to be readied, khaki jackets and caps for each except the dancer, who used the jacket cloth for needed pants. This sewing taken on by the mothers. 2 pairs of shoes. Again, the dancers started sewing soles for her extra pair while the others were bought. They then made a flag and put on it in Chinese characters, big gold characters, Long March to the Capital, and underneath it the names of their 2 schools. They would traverse historic ground and decided to verify their plans with a group from the Army. The Army men knew the mountains well and pointed out a grave error. The young people had not allowed for ups and downs, which brought the distance to nearly 2,000 miles, and for work they could offer along the way. They estimated 4 to 5 months. A stunned silence broke into discussion, not whether it could be done, but of family problems. It was decided that each should talk it over at home and meet again next day with their advisors. When they met, no family had held back, but talked seriously of ways and means of how the difficulties could be met. The dancer was still stitching at her soles, and a buddy remarked she could not get them done. They make soles out of cloth in China, shoe soles, and they're stitched with heavy hemp string. A soldier, a small man, asked about it and immediately took off his shoes. "Here," he said, "they are new, just issued to me today. My old pair's good enough." They fitted, and her last problem was solved. The soldier walked barefoot back to camp. No wonder we love our Army men. All this filled their days. Evenings they studied till past midnight, the 16 points action guide for Red Guards, and the Army rules long marchers pledged to follow. Don't accept as much as thread or needle from the people. Be polite, return anything found, do not swear or annoy, never hit anyone. Do not cross fields or in any way hurt property. Pay fairly for what you buy and pay for anything you break. These are the old rules from the old early working peasant Red Army days. These were discussed in depth with writings of Chairman Mao. Their own motives were probed. Was this only fun, adventure to any of them? If so, hardships and difficult jobs they found in villages might deter them. Some might turn back at the nearest railroad depot. They came to a united decision that they were out to serve the people and to steal themselves. And so they marched off. A boy returning on business for villagers who could not come themselves later. He took the train the next day to meet the group further on. Yes, they all developed blisters on their feet at first. They chose the hardest routes, had crossed a terrifying bridge of chains with no solid footing. Reception everywhere was wonderful, had at times been forced to accept meals, but left money with a note of thanks and explaining their pledge, to be found when they had gone. Had done 30 miles on their longest day and expected to reach Yan'an in 12 more days. I hope to tell you more of their march later on. I didn't yet receive the sequel to this letter. It is mimeographed by her own younger children, who she bought for them a duplicator, and she sends this letter out to many friends in America. I myself have a 17-year-old daughter in China who is a Red Guard, and she is, I just learned today, in a letter from David Crook, who spoke here some weeks ago, that she is working now in a mine in North Shanxi on one of these long marches. Now, these young people carried the ideas of the Cultural Revolution to the whole country, and soon young people were organizing in factories and farms and in every walk of life to support these ideas. Around the first of the year, it really became an issue in the going beyond culture into the whole sphere of production. And here the main issue is the question of incentive. The basic problem is whether China should follow a system of material incentive, should depend for the production drive on immediate material incentives for everyone, and on rather high salaries and payments for managers and technicians and white-collar workers, intellectual workers, or whether China should, on the other hand, depend primarily on political mobilization, on moral incentives for stimulating the enthusiasm in production which will carry the country forward. And under the second alternative, everyone go up more or less together. As the country improves, everyone's life improves. As opposed to the first alternative, where certain people would be able to advance rather rapidly to a higher level and find themselves in a privileged position, and in fact lead to the creation of a new privileged class, and maybe never get to socialism at all. Mao's position was that to depend primarily on material incentive, which is in fact to depend primarily on people's personal selfishness, is of course a method by which production can be advanced, but it will not lead to socialism. That, on the other hand, to take the harder way, maybe even the slower way, of mobilizing people's political consciousness and giving them the power to intervene in production decisions, and in fact to place the destiny of the country in their hands in this very direct way, will in fact be as effective, if not more effective in the long run, and will ensure that socialism and not something else is built. So this issue has been the primary one in the whole field of production, and a sharp struggle has occurred everywhere over it. There are in the leadership of the party those in the opposition who feel that material incentive is the only way to guarantee the effective hard work of the nation. And they have won a certain amount of support among rank-and-file workers and others. One can understand a basis for this support in a backward society where those workers in very advanced sectors have a productive capacity that is phenomenal when compared to the more general backward conditions of production. And since prices reflect the more laborious labor needed in the more backward sectors, those workers in advanced industry produce goods which command a tremendous wealth on the market. And they are in a position to exert pressure to get some of this wealth for their own wages and living standards. Their argument being that we are producing it, we should have a bigger share of it. This issue has agitated the Chinese Revolution ever since the Jinggangshan days and the old Jiangxi Soviet in 1928 and 1930. And it still agitates China today. The argument of Mao and his supporters is that these workers did not create this concentration of machinery which enables this higher productivity, that this is national property now, and that the surplus created there should become a national property to be invested wherever needed most to advance the whole country, and that it would not be right for any group of workers in any particular place to to take an unfair share of this surplus and use it for personal advancement. This argument is again that the people should in the main advance together, and that no group should go shooting ahead way above that of the rest of society. The struggle has been quite sharp. There have been not only verbal arguments, but some fights about it in plants and factories, in cities and provinces, and about the other issues involved in this whole revolution. What the young Red Guard type groups are basically fighting for, or against rather, is privilege. They have no patience with privilege of any sort, and as they join with others in setting up new municipal governments, new provincial governments, and taking over power from the old committees and old congresses that have ruled for 17 years, they are examining every leader, every cadre, every person in important position, regardless of his views in relation to his finances, privileges, his habits of work, his democratic or undemocratic outlook, and so on. Every single person will go before the gate, as they say, the gate being the examining group of the mass organizations, and they will pass or not pass depending on their record and on their attitude and whether they reform or not. Now, it isn't as if all the old leaders are on one side and all the young people are on the other. Joining the young people are many, many communist leaders, many managers, many technicians, many people in all walks of life who support the goals of the Cultural Revolution. Just to read the list of organizations that took over the city of Shanghai not so long ago indicates what a variety of people have done this. I won't read all of it because there are 36 organizations, but I'll read a few just to give you an idea. The Shanghai Workers' Revolutionary Rebel General Headquarters. This represents millions. The Preparatory Committee of the Shanghai Peasants' Revolutionary Rebel General Headquarters. There are 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 million peasants within the city limits of Shanghai. The Revolutionary Rebel General Headquarters of Shanghai Agricultural Management Organizations. These are commune leaders and cooperative leaders. The Revolutionary Rebel General Headquarters of Shanghai Animal Husbandry and Veterinary Service. These are the technicians in the country part of the city. The Bombard the Headquarters United Corps of Shanghai. Don't know who that is. Sounds like artillerymen, but obviously it isn't. The Defend Mao Zedong's Thought Fighting Corps of New Peking University. The Shanghai Liaison Center of the Jinggang Mountain Corps of Tsinghua University. The East is Red Corps of Tongji University. The Revolutionary Rebel Liaison Center of Organizations of the Shanghai Municipal Party Committee. Now that's an interesting one. These are the communists in the Shanghai Party Committee who support Mao and this whole revolution. They're joining with these students, peasants, workers, and others in setting up the new municipal government. The Revolutionary Rebel United Committee of Shanghai Municipal Organizations. This is a group of the city employees. The Red Guards Revolutionary Committee of Colleges and Universities of Shanghai. And so it goes. Physical culture students, journalists, publishing circles, the Rebel to the End Corps of Shanghai Jiaodong University. They have very militant names, these groups. And they mean business in terms of reforming society and setting China on a new road. Now, what they are doing is, in fact, taking over the whole of the government. Old cadre, young students, delegates of workers, peasants, and soldiers are setting up entirely new governments and initiating this examination of all the leaders, including those who are doing this. Everyone has to go before the committees of mass organizations. And as I said, this is not the first time this has happened in China. It has happened 4 or 5 major times and many smaller times in the past. Out of this, I believe, will come a new alliance of people in China united around Mao's program, and China will be more united and stronger than at any time in the past, and there will be more enthusiasm among the people for production and for the building of a new life than ever before, because they will more directly be responsible for it and will more directly have created it than ever before. I realize that this prediction puts me in contradiction to most of the experts speaking about China today. All these universities are holding conferences, and the professors are gathering, and they are shaking their heads about poor Mao and the fact that he has lost his grip on the modern world and doesn't really understand that you can't build a modern society without special pay for technicians and professors and the disaster that this is all causing in China. They're in the position of the old farmer in Vermont. When they asked him how to get from Putney to Pulteney, he scratched his head for a minute. He said, well, you take the road down to Bellows Falls. No, you won't get there that way. You take the road down here to Brattleboro. No, that won't get you there either. Then he paused and said, mister, you can't get there from here. Really, in fact, these professors don't think you can get to socialism from anywhere. So they think Mao must be wrong, and he certainly will fail. When I was talking at Penn State, Donald Zagoria, the most foremost of the young China watchers in this country, was lecturing at Penn State. He is at Columbia, and he's written a book called The Sino-Soviet Dispute, which made him something of a prophet because he wrote this book before the dispute was aired in public. And it wasn't a bad analysis, actually. So he's something of a prophet, and he is prophesying Mao's doom. And so I asked him if at any time in modern history he had ever thought that Mao had a practical program for China. He said, oh, well, we have not tended to underestimate the man. In fact, he has accomplished a great deal. I said, well, we all know that, but what I'm asking you is, at the time that he set out to accomplish any given stage of the revolution, did you think his program was practical, that he knew what he was about, that he understood the modern world? Say when he went to Jinggangshan in 1927 with 900 ragged peasants armed with spears, and he wrote an essay in which he said, in 30 years we will win China. Did you think that essay was a practical program for China? Well, Donald Zagoria hesitated. He said, well, there weren't many China watchers around in those days. It's true, you know, China was then under Western domination, and no one paid you to watch China. But now the situation is different. So he finally said, well, if I had been studying China in those days, I would have said Mao didn't have a chance. But now he's doomed. So I don't want to imply that just because Mao was right at many times in the past that he must be right today. He could be wrong. He is old, and he might easily, I suppose, make a wrong decision. On the other hand, the experts have always been wrong, and Mao has rarely been wrong, so that one must give Mao some benefit of the doubt. At almost every period in China's history, he has been able to seize on that key thing which touched the heart of the people and mobilized millions to carry through a revolution. And it was never something that was some immediate gain for them. They went into the mountains and fought those many years on a very hard road, and most people said they would never do it. After all, these are peasants. All they want is more. But in fact, they did do these things, and now today, I think they surely will undertake to build China in this equalitarian way that Mao has outlined.